Today, I'm going to talk about whether we should blame parents for everything that goes wrong with their children. But before I get into it, I want to invite you to join my Facebook group called What Makes People Tick. And if you go there and sign up, I'll send you a chapter of my book called More Than Bread and Butter. A psychologist speaks to progressives about what people really need in order to win and change the world. And I hope you find that interesting. Anyway, to get to the topic today, it seems as if psychologists are always blaming parents, especially mothers, for everything that goes wrong with their children. The tendency to blame mothers has a long history, of course. Following World War II, child experts, especially people like Dr. Spock, Benjamin Spock, counseled mothers about the emotional needs of their babies and the proper way to treat them. Their advice about child rearing techniques were often quite strict and actually disempowered mothers, often, describing as they did the various ways that mothering could and did fail. As researchers studied the vicissitudes of early attachment, the possibility or even probability that these delicate relationships could readily be disrupted reared its head throughout the world of child development. And as I considered my own clinical experience in treating adults and the theoretical lens through which I understood their problems, I realized that I too usually place the responsibility for adult psychological suffering at the doorstep of my patients' parents. And such a bias, as I thought about it, stemmed directly from my theory about psychopathology, about why people get ill to begin with, and about the change process. So my clinical work involves helping the patient identify what I call the pathogenic beliefs that they formed in childhood, that these beliefs that ultimately inhibit or interfere with the child's healthy development. My approach, in a sense, emphasizes trauma, even though it doesn't have to be severe trauma, and how it affected the children involved. And trauma, in the world of psychology, almost always involves failures in one or more family systems, including failures in empathy, in recognition, as well as the failures inherent in all sorts of different types of abuse. To give another example of how common this is of putting the problem at the doorstep of parents, a study of 17,000 people conducted in Southern California at Kaiser Permanente correlated the presence of what they called adverse childhood experiences with the development later of different types of physical and psychological disorders. These adverse childhood experiences included physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, exposure to domestic violence, household substance abuse, and household mental illness. This is basically a list of things that parents did do or could do wrong and or were harmful to children. And sure enough, the presence of these experiences in childhood predicted the development of all sorts of mental and physical disorders later on. So this shouldn't surprise anyone. We know that childhood, especially early childhood, is a time when children are dependent in absolute ways on their parents in order to develop their sense of everything, their sense of reality, their sense of morality. The child can't go to another family, after all, if things aren't working out well at home. The child's dependency, in other words, is profound and makes the child vulnerable to his or her parents' moods and attitudes and behavior and psychology. There is no other time in life where one is influenced as much by another person as there is in one's relationship with one's parents. So this is why we hold parents responsible for the psychological and emotional well-being of their children. Of course, it's also well known that children are born with certain temperaments and dispositions and certain proclivities to react to trauma in ways that sometimes are more or less resilient. So, for example, if a child is inherently difficult to soothe or comfort, which is sometimes an innate temperament in a child, then a parent who lacks patience may well especially harm that particular child, not because the parent is grossly failing as a parent, but because the interaction between the parent and child, a two-way interaction, is harmful. Some children, are just more resilient than others. They're able, in other words, to endure and somehow transcend family trauma. Not a lot is known about the origin of such resilience, but its presence is undeniable. And therefore, we, as a result, have to locate some of the responsibility for the development of mental illness in the child as much as in the parent. So one can look at the parent-child relationship as a two-way street, with each party responsible for the mental health outcomes in the child's development. However, no one would or could ever argue that this two-way street is symmetrical. That is, it's incontrovertible that parents affect children more than children affect parents. For a child, the dependence on the parent is absolute. For the parent, his or her dependence on the child, while significant, is only relative. That is, the parent has other relationships and is engaged in other aspects of the social world than simply the relationship with the child. The relationship may be a two-way street, you see, but the traffic is not equal in each direction. So if that's true, what stops us from being accused justifiably of parent blaming? Well, I think the issue concerns the concept of blame. See, if we maintain that parents have an inordinate effect on children, that they have a life or death authority and power to define reality and morality for the child, and therefore that they are mainly responsible for the child's mental health outcomes, is this the same as blame? See, I don't think so. I think that acknowledging that parents are responsible for their children's emotional well-being is simply empirical, observable, and objective. Blame is another matter altogether. Blame, you see, involves disapproval, reproach, censure, almost an accusation. These are emotional states, and they're not scientific observations. There's a further reason why assigning responsibility for a child's psychic well-being to parents is not the same as blame. See, parents are not simply agents of influence in the family, but they are themselves often victims of forces beyond and outside their control, aren't they? First of all, parents were themselves once children and were shaped by their own parents. But more than that, parents live and rear their children in social and cultural worlds over which they really have no control. Their approaches to child rearing then are affected by social standards and norms, role modeling, expert advice, and propaganda. So consider this as an example. Following World War II, there were profound changes in family structure and child rearing practices in most Western societies, but I'll just limit it to the United States. Broad demographic changes resulted in the shrinking of family size, the breakdown of community bonds, the exit of women from the workforce, and this massive suburbanization, all resulting in parents and parenting taking place in smaller and smaller nuclear families in which women were primarily responsible for their children's emotional life and development. Men, fathers, commuted to work for longer hours and distances. Female domesticity was celebrated, and child rearing advice was increasingly directed at women who no longer had extended families around to help them in the task. The sense of alienation that so many women felt in the 1950s resulted from these kinds of social changes, and they resulted in what Betty Friedan once called, quote, the problem with no name. So think about it. When we think about the ways that children are dependent on their parents for their core sense of the way the world is, the way it's supposed to be, reality, we're mostly talking about their dependence on mothers. And their mothers were too often suffering in their role as mothers through no fault of their own. So understanding the social milieu in which our parents raised us should lead us to feel great compassion rather than critical judgment. Confronting the social causes of psychological suffering in parents should lead us to put the idiosyncratic mishaps in family life into some broader context. If we're feminists or social critics, we should see child rearing as occurring in the context of a sex-gender system in which women, that is mothers, often felt oppressed. In this way, we stop locating responsibilities solely and exclusively in the authority that parents have over kids and add to the mix the responsibility that our culture has in shaping the psyches of these same parents. I'll give you an example. A patient of mine described a conversation that his parents had just prior to their marriage in the late 1940s. His mother, the patient's mother, had been working at a bank, thoroughly enjoying her job and the independence and the social contact that the job brought her. But her own mother told her after she got married to my patient's father that she needed to stop working. And of course, women were stopping working all over, that the mother needed to stop working and that it was her husband's job to support her. And so my patient's mother went to her fiance and told him that this was the new rules of the road. Later on, the father talked to the son, my patient, about this, and he said that when the patient's mother told him that, he felt this sinking feeling. His heart sank, as if a door had swung shut on his life. And in fact, as this couple then proceeded to have children, the mother became increasingly depressed and the father took to drinking. They were living the American dream on the outside, but it had become a nightmare. And this nightmare was then visited on the children, who had to cope with neglect and the guilt associated with having two unhappy parents. So understanding the interaction between private parenting and social expectations is crucial in my view. If we're interested in studying the effect of the outside world on private psychological experience, we need to look no further than how the psychologies of parents are shaped by their social roles and cultural expectations. In other words, the world, the outside world, is mediated through the psychology of parents. What seems so private is actually shaped by what's public. In this way, I think we extend our empathy to both parents and children, understanding both as victims of forces beyond their control.